This has been really intriguing, and I'm going to talk about facts, and I'm going to talk about models, and I'm going to talk about metaphors, and I really am serious that the idea is to sort of arm everybody. And I think that, as I was just saying to Betty and Nietzsche, in the end, diversity will win because it is the only solution to complexity. Period. End of story. Good. It's what Jeffrey was saying. The state of the world is such that the existing canonical models will simply fail. And in that respect, complexity, as in all things, is the solution. So, all right, so here's the sort of premise, right? So, and this is really true. If I said to you, here's the design challenge. You have to design the ultimate tool that is going to solve a problem, and I'm not going to tell you what the problem is. But you have to design it, and it has to be the ultimate tool. And you'd say, that's just ridiculous. And it's just not possible. But it is. Now that I have this slide up, yesterday I was thinking the Doctor Who's of the world are about as diverse as the Volkswagen executive board. And seeing that, yes. Right? But that'll probably change soon. But this is what you are raised on in Britain as science fiction. This is an old show. Who's watched Doctor Who here? Well, it's good, very good. And, you know, Doctor Who, there's a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey, and they have avatars. They die, and then they're reincarnated. I don't know if this is temporal. It's not. I was raised with this one, Tom Baker, whose wife, actually, Lana Ward, I knew, married Richard Dawkins, actually. But anyway, so he's married to a former wife of a Time Lord. Anyway. But the funny thing is, this is British science fiction. So in American science fiction, Star Trek, which was created in about '66, you had this Starship Enterprise. British science fiction, the Starship is a police box. So, you know, a little disappointing. But the Time Lord, the reason I mention this, the Time Lords had a sonic screwdriver. And the sonic, so you can see through the ages, the evolution of the sonic screwdriver. What is a sonic screwdriver? It's actually very interesting. You can go to Wikipedia and it'll tell you. Here it is. The functions of a sonic screwdriver are based on its power over sound waves, radiation, wavelengths, frequency signals, and electromagnetism. It is shown to hack, disable, activate, and otherwise control technology from almost everything, allowing it to remotely control almost any machinery, mechanisms, and computers. It is applied to allowing it to open locks, detonate explosives, remotely activate electronics, override most systems, activate computers, and cause some energy weapons to burst into flames or sparks. So, that's the kind of tool we want. It's the kind of tool I desperately wanted as a child, and it turns out the tool exists, and it's called diversity. And that's the premise. And this was the canonical text, right? The Origin of Species, published in 1859. And its fuel is essentially diversity. Evolution's fuel is diversity. I'm going to basically show you that if you don't have it, evolution and learning stops. And we have proofs. And so I'm hoping that you'll leave here with proofs that say that without diversity, there simply cannot be adaptation. End of game. Here's the Origin of Species. Darwin was interested in finding laws governing the living world. That's what that book is about. And the laws were presented in chapter 14 of the Origin of Species. And here they are. The laws were growth, that Jeffrey talked about, inheritance, that we haven't talked about so much, transmission, if you like, and variability, diversity. There's been a request for definitions of diversity. We can do it, and I'm hoping with Andrea afterwards we can talk about having a box, and we'll just put them all in. Variability, disparity, diversity, entropy, heterogeneity. We can do them all. And they all have definitions. I'm not sure how useful they are, but there you go. And here's the famous tree from chapter 14, where Darwin first shows the consequences of those laws on life, which is diversification. So I'm going to go through a series of sort of evolutionary arguments, and for me evolution is not just about biology, it's about culture, it's about technology, where diversity plays a critical role. And then I'll sort of show you how companies, research institutes, represent strategic points in a landscape that exploit diversity in very unique ways. So first of all, this is the consequence of natural selection. And it's sort of, even for those of us who teach it, right, you can't quite believe it. So on the left, a leaf insect, and on the right, a gecko. Just exquisitely adapted to their environment to the point where you think, really? Wasn't it God after all? You know, it's one of those things where you can't quite believe it. And just to make matters worse, they can change through the seasons. Right. And so anyway, whatever. So here's how we think about it. And this has been, again, I think Murder talked about it, Stephanie talked about it, Scott talked about it, but I want to really drill home this idea of these complex versus simple landscapes, when diversity is useful and when it's not, actually. So here's how we typically think about optimization in evolutionary systems. So you saw a lot of these yesterday. So this is the idea. You have some set of traits, let's say price and cost. And you can sort of imagine, right, you're making an artifact. If you don't invest any money in it, then it's going to be crappy, and it won't be very good. If you invest too much money in it, you lose everything, even if you sell it. And the same for price. If I charge nothing for it, I don't recuperate my costs. If I charge too much for it, no one will buy it. So there's some sweet spot in this landscape in terms of the cost of manufacture and the price that you charge in the market that will maximize the return. So that's how everyone thinks about the world. And so here's a spider. This is a very brash spider. And actually, it's very interesting. It's a very unfit spider. It's, the reason it survived is because of sexual selection, which I'm not going to talk about, not natural selection. Because this thing gets eaten by everybody because it's so loud. It has an incredibly low fitness. As opposed to this one that you can barely see. Right, so this one, predators fail to see it. So it's evolved in this multidimensional trait space in such a way that it's inconspicuous. Here's a car that didn't do very well. Does anyone know what that car is? Who said that? It's a Lada. Yeah. No, it's not a Lada. It's a Russian Lada. Yeah. Okay, so that's not very good, I imagine. It's sort of a low-cost, low-price vehicle. Didn't do very well, but, you know. And here's a car that didn't do very well either that was very expensive. What's that? DeLorean. Yeah, you know, and so that was perhaps a little too expensive. But, you know, the best-selling car in the world is the Toyota Corolla, right? So I think it's a Toyota. I don't think it's a Toyota. It's a Camry, something like that. Well, that's a Honda Corolla. It's a car that, you know, is neither too expensive nor too costly to manufacture, and it sells better than everything else. So that, again, this is how we think, right? And you can do it all over the place. You can do it machine learning. You can say, well, we want to optimize some functions, kind of thing Graham's talking about. You know, sometimes too much data is a problem because you might overfit the data. Too little data, you can't learn. Computation's the same. It can be too expensive. And I'm doing this because I'm going to show you that every problem that we think about can be conceptualized in terms like this, and every problem that can be conceptualized in terms like this needs diversity to be solved. So that's the premise, right? So how do we think about it? Now, I should add, and this Murder talked about yesterday, it's very rare that landscapes look like that. More often or not, there are lots of solutions that are more or less okay that you could discover. And the question is there a better one out there? And it's a very interesting question how you would ever know. How do you know whether or not you're here and that peak even exists? Which is interesting. And so that's the idea. You could be here, here, or there, and we don't quite know where we are. So this is how evolution works. You start off in some low fitness position in that landscape, and you hill climb. This is optimization. This is what has been talked about. And you end up, hopefully, at a peak. And that's what you will do if the landscape is unimodal. Darwin, who was mathematized in the 19 teens and 20s, can write down some equations, and you can show that that will happen. If that landscape is nicely continuous under natural selection with variation, you will find the peak. Okay? Not controversial. Bayes, 100 years earlier, without realizing it, discovered the same theory. He was interested in inference, in learning, how you learn things. Many of you have heard about Bayesian inference. And this is Bayes' rule on the right, in mathematical terms. And we now know, and this is some work that I've done and many others, that all learning frameworks, reinforcement learning, Bayesian updating, operant conditioning, all of them have the same fundamental mathematical form. And you can prove this. So here's Bayesian Darwinism. What is an offspring? An offspring is the hypothesis of the parents formulated through the success of your ancestors at predicting the current state of the world. So an organism is a hypothesis about the world, a hypothesis posited by the parents. That's what it is. That's what I am, my parents' hypothesis about the world. And you can turn it around and talk about Darwinian Bayesianism. Successful hypotheses are the surviving ideas in the battle of existence in the environment of experiments. So I just want to point out, we now have 200 years of observation and theory that's culminating now with a unified model of what adaptation is. Okay. And here's, I'm just going to show you how it works. Imagine that you saw a coin, you didn't know it was a fair coin. And there's some population that believes that, you're going to get heads with 0.8 and tails with 0.2, and another population that thinks the reverse. All of these frameworks do the following. They start with these populations of estimates, and over the course of time, over the series of experiments, they slowly observe and learn and converge on, as it turns out, in this instance, the correct solution, which is a fair coin. Probability half heads, probability half tails. This is what adaptive dynamics does. It starts with variation around a solution, finds it, and eliminates it. So this is important. So all of these learning environments, frameworks, do two things. You have variation around an optimum, and the distribution shifts towards it, phase one. Phase two, once you're around the solution, you eliminate it. So one of the reasons why there isn't as much diversity in the world as we might like is because we found the solution. That's why. We haven't found the global optimum solution, but we found one, and we don't know if there's another one. So you shouldn't be surprised at all that there's no diversity, because evolutionary dynamics, which I've told you generalizes to all learning schemes, has to eliminate it to reach its target. And that's what happens in unimodal landscapes. Okay. This is so well known that it's called the fundamental theory of natural selection, formulated by Ronald Fisher in 1930. All evolution, in order to take place, needs variability. That's what that equation says. And once you reach your target, there isn't any left. Okay. So we now know why we need it, and we also know why we don't have it. Okay. Now, the problem is most landscapes are not simple, and they don't remain there forever, right? That's a complex environment, and that's why the complex environment, in some sense, will require diversity. Simple landscapes don't. The history, if you like, of technology, the history of society, rightly or wrongly, has been articulated as a series of simple problems, which lead to the reduction of diversity. So let me show you what I mean. So these are kind of beautiful, real things. On the left is a fly that's a mutant, and its body is covered in eyes. And on the right is this beautiful fused flower that looks like a caterpillar. And nature generates these things. It spits out these odd variants. Because nature is never certain that it's found the target, right? Or that the environment isn't changing. That's one really interesting difference between evolution, I think, and culture. Evolution doesn't really become fully complacent. All right. So here's how an engineer would think about it. That's what optimization is. It's gradient descent. Gradient descent doesn't work very well in complex landscapes. Simple optimization, variance minimization doesn't work. This world, the complex world, needs more sophisticated means of problem solving. And all of those sophisticated means of problem solving use variance or diversity chronically. So, oh yes, so we would all like to be able to serve like this, okay? Unfortunately, because the landscape is complex, some people serve like that, and that person could carry on. I don't know who that is, probably a famous tennis player. That person could, well, no longer would be, I mean, at some point you could be a tennis player like that. But you know, he doesn't know that he's serving in a preposterous fashion. But he'll go and watch Roger Federer and he'll think, oh my gosh, there's another way of being a tennis player. Anyway, so the point. So what do you do when you get stuck in one of these local optima? What does evolution tell us is possible? So here's Fisher. Fisher says you've run out of fuel because you have to. Because learning and adaptation eliminates variance. Variance is the fuel used to reach the solution. In the 1920s, Murder touched on this in a totally different domain, which is these interesting rhyming insights of different fields. Sewell Wright discovered the shifting balance. Use the shifting balance. It's like a martial arts move. And what's the shifting balance? And so here's the shifting balance. Here's that landscape. I've depleted my diversity fuel. How am I going to get over there? How am I going to serve like Roger Federer and not like that other guy? And we know. We know the answer. Murder talked about it yesterday. Introduce variability into the population. The easiest way of doing it, just statistically, is reduce the population size. And in evolutionary biology, moving between peaks in a non-systematic fashion, just moving around, is called drift. And this is how it works. Once you turn n down, once you increase the variability, something interesting happens. You start drifting over the landscape in every single direction, slowly. Okay, so this is the interesting point. It's insensitive to variation in utility, which is good, but it's slow. It's going to take ages to reach the peak. But if you turn n up again, and you're in the sort of vicinity in the foothills of a real peak, you'll zoom to the top. So the obvious solution that evolution has discovered, but for some weird reason organizations haven't, is you should systematically alternate the value of n. So what evolution does, it's called speciation. I'll leave that aside. There's another method which is really interesting that evolution has discovered, and it's leveling the peaks. Let's say I'm stuck here. What could I do to prevent myself being locally stuck? I could level it, right? Yeah, level the peak. And so how do you do that? Well, competitive macroevolution. It's actually very related to adversarial neural networks. Darwin realized this, just drop species on it until it's squashed. And that's exactly what happens if you think about it, in business. If everyone's doing the same thing, there's just no profitability left. There is no peak. It's gone. And so you climb up the hill because just by virtue of the number of competitors chasing the same resource, the marginal value has gone to zero. Better move. Get to the peak, new peak. And that's exactly, I think, what we're seeing in cell phones, right? It's total macroevolutionary saturation. No one can convince anyone with a brain that an iPhone is better than a Samsung, or Samsung is better than whatever else. They're just identical. And the way that we're sold these products is based on sort of false signals of distinction. Color, curvature of the glass. I mean, the fact that there's so many articles written on, the glass goes all the way to the edge. It goes all the way to the edge, you know. I have to have one. I'm throwing everything out, because going all the way to the edge is the most important thing in the universe, right? So it's just unbelievable pathological behavior. So there you go. There's another one that hasn't been talked about, which is really interesting, which is the magic of dimensions. And this is a bit more subtle. The fact is, when I show you something like this, I say price and cost, these aren't really single dimensions. If you think about your sales strategy and your engineering strategy, so I'm going to hire the best person to do the engineering, and I'm going to hire the best person to sell the product. Well, everyone in this room knows that that's not one value, it's not one trait, it's actually a suite of characteristics that are important in both. So these landscapes are a bit misleading because they're not really single dimensions that you're moving down. In order to move along this axis, you could sort of change lots of things, right? So it's not really one dimension. In this particular instance, it's a five-dimensional simplex. These axes can mislead you. And to move along them, what you do is you change the composition of the set of characteristics that inform engineering strategy or sales strategy. And that's a really interesting thing, and Stephanie touched on this in her neutral networks result. What this does is it allows you to move in the higher dimensions which are hidden from you. And so you think you're living in this sort of three-dimensional world, but you're actually living in a much higher dimensional world. And just to make this very concrete, let's say you think we just have to hire people, more and more people from Stanford, because they're the only people who know how to do machine learning, right? Well, you might think that maybe the talent is not all that matters. Maybe something else matters. Maybe the composition matters. Most of the time, we're living in a much higher dimensional space than we realize. This is the whole point of Moneyball, the whole point. And so know your dimensions. And because you can actually tunnel through those higher dimensions without drift, without flattening the landscape, by just changing the composition of the strategy. This is a fact of evolution, and I'm not sure it's well understood outside of it. This one, persistence, robustness. Very interesting. That is one of the interesting characteristics of the natural world, right? On the left, there's Phineas Gage, very well-known individual, 19th century, working on trains, and an explosive sent this metal bar through his skull. This is the real picture. Shot up through the base of his skull, came out the top of his head. Everyone ran over to him. He said, "It's okay, I'm all right." They said, "I'm not sure. You might not want to look in a mirror because half of your brain was just shot out and you've got a hole in your head." But he said, "No, I'm fine." And, about a month later, he became super aggressive. Very famous story that Oliver Sacks talks about, that his personality changed. It was one of the early natural, unfortunate experiments that gave us a sense of which areas of the brain control personality. A collaborator of mine did a very famous set of experiments, Mike Gazzaniga with Roger Sperry, where they severed the two hemispheres in individuals who were suffering from grand mal epilepsy. So epilepsy is a very peculiar condition of uncontrolled electrical activity in the brain, and it spreads as like a cascade through connected cells. And so this was a very, very draconian, sort of brutal measure that essentially prevented the epileptic seizure electrically from propagating across the hemispheres. So they just cut them in half. Well, that seems rather, people woke up, they had two brains, and they couldn't tell the difference. It was like, really? And it's a very interesting set of stories. For those interested, I can talk about them at length. Nevertheless, the fact is it's very hard to imagine anything we've ever built where you removed most of the connections and it would continue to function. 30% was very impressive. This is much more than that. And of course, animals, and us included, we adapt very quickly and can restore function under extraordinary perturbations. So robustness is a characteristic of the natural world. And it also uses diversity. I'm just to show you quickly. Imagine you have some network, and each node is integrating information from others. So let's pick one. So imagine that's it. So here we are. We're just looking at one of them, and we're looking at all the inputs it's getting. And you said, I'm going to actually, and it has to perform a mapping, it has to take those inputs and produce the appropriate output. Every node has to do that in the network. And then you say, I'm going to knock some out. Take them out. Well, for me to continue to do the same thing, what has to happen? Well, those have to change. If I'm going to approximate what I was doing before, but I lose something, I have to adapt, right? It's like gait. If you take one leg away, I can't walk the same way. So the remaining leg has to behave differently. Well, I've already told you. There's only one mechanism that we know of that allows you to adapt, and that's using variation and diversity as a fuel. And a number of years ago, so I told you that, Fisher's fundamental theorem, a few of us, Nihat, Jess, and I, we proved a theorem that said that no system can be robust without a store of diversity. And you can calculate exactly what it is. And so imagine this is what you were. That's some space of functions. I perturb the system by knocking things out. I fall down to here. And that's the very best I can do once I've exhausted my store of variability. So this is like your fuel store. Okay? So robustness is really no different from adaptation. Sometimes it feels like the opposite. Adaptation is moving to a peak, and robustness is remaining as you were, but it's not really true, right? Because robustness is only important when you perturb. So you're perturbing away from where you were, so now you have to adapt. So actually, the theory of robustness looks just like the theory of evolution by natural selection. It's just a slightly different spin on it, right? And nature has discovered something really extraordinary. And this is maybe more involved than I would like to get. But you've probably all heard about junk DNA, and why are we storing all this information that we don't use? Most of the genome that you contain, well, forgetting microbiome for a moment, which totally dominates, but that aside, isn't evidently used. And in the last 10 years only, we've realized that there are huge stores of variation that are called on when the environment changes. You don't see it. It's called cryptic variation. And so for example, let's say that there's some characteristic phenotype that has very low variance, so it doesn't look diverse at all. There's very little variation. Then the environment goes nuts. What happens? All that cryptic variation comes to the surface. And why does that cryptic variation come to the surface? So that you can adapt, right? Because we already know from the fundamental theorem there's no evolution without diversity. And in this case of diversity, it is variance, the number of variants in the population. Each represent a unique phenotype. So once again, this is very intriguing. It's somehow evolution, this is sometimes called evolvability. Evolution learned to store diversity that's almost never used. Okay? And that when that first was proposed, people didn't believe it. They said, no way. It would just, but it does, way. Okay, so it is the case. And it's really interesting how that all works. And the basic insight, for those of you who have hung around SF5 for long enough, the one way to think about this is, was articulated by Waddington in his so-called epigenetic landscape. So think about rolling down a hill, and the bottom, the basins of this landscape are the solutions that you can access. So think about development into a particular form and so on. And that landscape is being girded by this regulatory network, by all these struts and girders that stand for the interactions between genes. So that's what structures that landscape. And what this decanalization does when the environment goes a bit weird is it sparsifies the underlying architecture of the supporting structure. And so that landscape flattens. And so you can access alternative points in the landscape that formerly were inaccessible because the ball was always rolling down the hill through those canals. Of course, that hill metaphor is a sort of a metaphor for some complex state space that you're moving through. It could be function. It could be He Jin's point about how distributions change in time in cities and Jeffrey's point. And we know how this works. So what you're doing in a way, it's not reducing n, it's reducing the connectivity. So it's not the components that you're changing the density of the connections between the components. And evolution has learned how to do this when the environment changes in unanticipated ways. So, okay, so that's just, again, just give you a little bit of weaponry to show you how evolution actually works and uses diversity and how it's absolutely essential for optimizing in complex landscapes and ensuring robustness in uncertain conditions. I want to talk about something slightly weird here, briefly, which is universality. I mean, I mentioned this at the beginning, right? That the computer was thought to be only useful for one thing. It was accounting or something, ballistics. And they failed to understand universality because you can use it for art. And evolution did something really, really surprising 630 million years ago. And if I didn't know better, it would make me a creationist. Okay? And I'll tell you what it did. It developed an operating system that could run any app. But the apps that it runs are body forms. And the operating system is called the homeobox. So just to show you how this works, so that's a universal computer. We all understand, right, that you can run any program on it. The most successful companies, this is why platform companies are interesting, right? Best thing for you to do is not to build a solution, but to build an environment in which anyone can build a solution. That's why Apple's iPhones are successful, right? Because what's an iPhone? Well, it's that, right? Or whatever, Android, whatever you like. What you build the OS. Don't build the solution. Build the universal environment in which anything can be built. And that's a whole different engineering principle, right? And evolution did it. Evolution developed the universal metazoan constructor about 630 million years ago. And this is very surprising, I think. What do I mean by that? There it is. That's the essential, coarse-grained, schematic circuitry of the universal body-type constructor. Everything from about 630 million years to the present uses the same basic program to create your body, whether you're a shrew or an elephant. This is another sense in which you're the same. It's not they just collapse onto the same growth curves, or they actually have exactly the same program in them with a few parameters changed. And here it is. And so we now know what that program looks like. This is just color coding certain genes. And the way you go essentially from a fly to us is just, turn that thing off. Just turn that dial down. Human. Turn that one up. Fly. Mouse. It's kind of demoralizing. Not for me, because I prefer those species to humans. But for most humans, that's demoralizing. That's part of real diversity, understanding diversity beyond human beings, actually, to encompass non-human life forms, to include plants and non-human animals. We haven't really talked about that. We should have, because they're as important in an evolutionary sense as we are. So, and here's the weird experiment you can do. You can take a gene out of a fly and put it in a human. Works. Take a gene out of a human, put it in a fly. Works. Not all of them, but it's really shocking, right? It's a conceptual revolution to me as important, of several Nobel Prizes for this, of course, as important as Darwin's revolution. So Darwin showed us that we're all related. The biggest ethical contribution, I think, made by any human being, that we are essentially flies. But this revolution is also interesting, that we all run the same program, and that where you change these body forms is just with a few little tweaks. So now, having said all of that, I want to talk about the strategies that life adopts that exploit those properties. So all life forms can use optimization in rugged landscapes and the shifting balance and competitive macroevolution and high-dimensional search. This is available to all of us. And the question then is, why are there bacteria? They do it, And why are there mammals? We do it. We all do it. But for some reason, there's diversity at the level of the forms, right, of the solutions. Why is there diversity there? And this is very interesting, and I'll try and explain why I think there is. So here's a way of thinking, classifying, if you like, the fundamental elements of the solution space. Population size. Are there many individuals or a few? How mutable are they? How rapidly do they change in time? What is the cost of production of the individual unit? This is interesting. How much time do you dedicate to growth versus copying yourself? So we, before we become reproductively mature, spend a lot of time growing. That's not true for E. coli. Right? And this is a neat one. How much information is propagated vertically from parents to their offspring versus horizontally from me to you? Right? Bacteria, as I'll show you in a minute, do much more horizontal than vertical. So these dimensions essentially control the way that diversity is exploited in the adaptive processes that I've described. Okay, that's the point. So let's look at them. And I'm going to just define them for you. I'm going to define a draft as, in the sort of common, in the common usage sense, as an imperfect, highly variable prototype. It's quick and cheap to produce, and it's good for exploration. You can just write a draft for me, and it doesn't have to be great. Just get the ideas down, sort of thing. Okay. Blueprints, different. Near perfect, very consistent, very optimized, because I'm going to use the blueprint to produce many copies. Markets. So interesting. Markets are slowly aggregated blueprints, typically. And so if you think about companies, they're fairly optimized. They're not drafts. I mean, they might be. Occasionally they are. And they're typically somewhat robust. And parliaments, and you'll see where I'm going with this, are essentially highly coordinated decision-making markets. And they're good at exploration and robustness. I'm going to say that the world conforms to this scheme, more or less. So let me give you some examples. Drafts. The prokaryotic cell, the microbial world, okay? Very large N, large numbers of individuals, highly mutable, dominated by horizontal gene transfer, so that's a ratio, so V over H. If H was very large, then V over H would be small, and so that's why that's true. The individual units are very cheap, very low cost, and they replicate much faster rate than they grow. So much of the time is spent in replication, not in growth. That's one solution to living in the world. Here's another one, the blueprint. This is the eukaryotic cells that we're made from. It looks like a rotation. It's like a five-fold symmetry, this looks like a bit. And so what's happened here is that eukaryotic cells don't really talk to each other horizontally. Their information is transmitted vertically. That was one of the very big shifts in the evolution of life on Earth, the shift from information being broadly shared to information only being shared with offspring, which is kind of interesting. And the mutability is very low. So they're more like blueprints, right? They generate information, they circulate not freely, but with high fidelity. That's what a eukaryotic cell looks like. Here's a market, here's a metazoan, here's a multicellular organism. Multicellular organisms are kind of interesting. They're spending much more on growth than on replication, and they're very high cost. So making me is costly. That's why my mum only had 2 kids, not 4 million, which is right, that wasn't an option. And time, space, money, sanity, etc. Parliaments. Brains are very interesting. Special kind of market where actually the horizontal connections between the cells is very, very high. So they're really good at a certain kind of information sharing. One neuron can know about another neuron without being the offspring of the neuron. So this is kind of interesting, and you can use this scheme to look at other things that aren't biological, like SFI. SFI is like a parliament of drafts, right? So SFI is interesting. It's highly mutable. I have no idea what Jeffrey's talking about. He's mutated into his space. I've mutated into mine. We're all costly. 60% of SFI is salary, right? We're a costly outfit at personnel level. The N is small. There aren't many of us, right? And there's lots of horizontal communication, right? So we're a sort of interesting life form in the space of life forms. Here's a regular university department. It's more like a market. Large N, lots of people. Not at all mutable. They're all the same. The cost is high, dominated by vertical transmission. Labs, my students. Right? That's how it works at university. What lab are you in? Who cares? At SFI, that would be a heresy, right? No one's. But at university, you are. I'm in the X lab. I'm in the Y lab. And all that I know gets transmitted to my graduate students. Not true at SFI. Right? All that I know gets transmitted to everybody, right? So we're more like prokaryotes in that respect, but at high cost and low end. So it's sort of a new form. So okay, so that's one company. Here's another one, car companies, and you can sort of play this game. It's kind of interesting to ask what you are, and the reason it matters, by the way, and I have some time, is that every one of these benefits from mechanisms of optimization and exploration in very different ways. And I sort of alluded to this yesterday, right? So if you're the microbial strategy, 99% of you are going to die. That's how you optimize. Low cost, just get rid of most of the variants. If you're multicellular, that's not true. It's too high a cost. And you need a totally different strategy with respect to the use of variability. And so you can keep multiplying these Uber and Y Combinator and just ask this weird landscape of different forms with respect to these dimensions which control how you use variability.
But the car company looks like the research.
Yeah, there's usually like one thing different. The car company, research universities are like car companies, unfortunately. Yeah. Right, that's probably why they're so uninspiring. I mean, they're really producing one product per department, per lab with high fidelity. They're highly optimized, right? It's sort of what they do. So that's sort of it. I don't want to go on forever about some conversations, but just to review what I've sort of said. And hopefully now everyone gets this. Provable theorem. Without the diversity and variation, there is no evolution. Done. Okay. Doesn't matter whether it's cultural evolution, learning, adaptive evolution. It just doesn't work. It's interesting to try and imagine what would work. And by the way, what would work is if you knew the answer. That's it. That's how it happens, right? So if you said, I can calculate through ingenuity and brute force computation precisely what I should do, then you don't need diversity. And what that presumes is you have perfect information and infinite computational power. That's the universe where diversity doesn't matter. So I've gone through these ways in which variation is modulated, shifting balance, fitness leveling, sparsification of regulatory networks, and so on. There isn't a best way to do it. Depends where you are. Robustness needs it, right? You need this store of non-functional information, and that's really, I don't know what that would mean in a company. It's actually really interesting. It would be like having more personnel that are not useful at any given point in time than that are useful. That's what biology did. Well, sort of weird. I mean, and the reason it's true is because the environment is changing so quickly that you have to keep them, right? If it changed slowly, I wouldn't need them. I could just recruit when I needed them, right? And that's true in simple, unchanging landscapes. If it's really changing that far, and Jeffrey's telling us the world is changing faster and faster, this might actually be what you need to do as a company. You have to keep on and hold variability that you're actually not using. Sort of a national lab model, right? You say, you're smart, I'm going to keep you here because I know at some point I'm going to mobilize you in a team where you become useful. It's a very peculiar economic model, but it might be absolutely essential in a very uncertain environment. This notion that the ultimate thing to do, right, is not to have a function, but to be metafunctional. That the ultimate company doesn't do one thing. It's a sort of what we're seeing in software, I guess, but you can do anything because you've built the infrastructure that can support any function. And that's what evolution discovered very early. It's sort of surprising, right? And one can discuss why that was or how that was possible, but again, that might be necessary in this new world order, that to say that you're a software company, it's not true anymore. What you are is a company that's built some kind of environment that can support the production of almost any function. It's very peculiar. Sort of SFI-like, quite frankly, where we're sort of like that in the world of ideas to some extent, but we're limited, of course. We don't do the humanities. We're not very artistic. Well, some of us are, but most aren't. And, but that sort of idea. And this idea, finally, that there really are distinct strategic styles. There's not just one best way of doing all of that. There are really distinct ways according to what you're prepared to lose, if you like, or according to your budget, right? Bacteria don't have budget, right? And so they just have to be scrappy. And it works because they just do multiplicity. But if you do have budget, you might want to go the other way and become a eukaryote. And if you have a lot of budget, you become a multicellular eukaryote. Even though there are efficiencies of scale. But they are, in absolute terms, more expensive. And I think with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much.